Welcome to Lecture 3. Today we're going to be talking about the press in the American colonies. This is the today's picture of our TA, Gina, and I don't know if you remember, but I think it was about a year ago or so, there was this meme that was going around of people putting eggs along with their pictures, and anyway, this is our contribution to that meme that was going around. This is her picture as a puppy. She's probably like 16 weeks old or so at this point. And yeah, here's another picture. It's kind of blown out actually, but it's the first time she went to the beach, and she had a lot of fun figuring out that sand really was difficult to dig in, but she still liked to do it. Anyway, there's the pictures of our TA for this lecture, and there will be more in the upcoming lectures. So as I mentioned, today we're going to be talking about the colonial press, and before it was history, stuff that we study as American history, it was current news, just like what happens today or what happened in the 60s or 70s or any other decade. Now, by the time the American Revolution started, the role of the newspapers in the colonies were more essential than other forms of media at the time. Remember, there were no movies, there was no internet, there were only books, magazines, which were a little different than what we think of at the time because printing technology, like we learned in the second lecture, was very rudimentary by that point. But magazines were around, pamphlets and broadsides were the main sources of media at the time. And the newspapers in the colonies were more essential than those, one, because they were more affordable, and two, they were easier to print. And so they were a major source of news on what was happening in Europe and in the colonies. And they also printed, like I mentioned, broadsides, which is basically one side of a huge sheet of paper. And it was for things like proclamations or things that took a lot of room. So I don't know if you remember the picture of, it was in lecture number 1, but I had it in number 2. It was a picture of me holding up Scooby-Doo thing. Broadsides were like the size of those. If you need something larger to print, they were usually on a huge sheet of paper. And they had events on them and other information that needed to be seen or felt that was need to be seen by people. Other sources of information were almanacs. Remember, the U.S. at the time, or the colonies, it wasn't even the U.S., was mostly agrarian. So it was populated by mostly farmers, and almanacs were hugely important for news of weather, crop information, and things like that. Pamphlets and books were also popular, and again, the news was more, newspapers were more essential than pamphlets and books, but people still consumed them because pamphlets and books tended to carry other information that wasn't necessarily about politics or the colonies. So by the end of the French and Indian War in 1673, each colony had at least one printer. Some colonies had multiple printers, but all of the 13 colonies by that point had at least one printer. And mind you, this is just over a decade before the revolution started. So by the time the war broke out in the colonies, between the colonies and Great Britain, that was in 1775, there were a total of 38 newspapers being printed in America. Then there were a total of roughly about 50 presses. So some newspapers were copied on multiple presses and in different markets. But compared today, where there are thousands of presses, and it's debatable on how many actual print newspapers there are, but probably still thousands of newspapers. There was very little going on in terms of print at the time, but there was still printing going on, and for 13 colonies, it was still quite a bit amount of printing. So circulation kind of took off during this time. It was roughly between 350 copies to over 1,000, depending on where you lived. The bigger cities, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, just like today with like Los Angeles and New York still, they tend to outsell more newspapers than anywhere else in the country just based on the population that reads the papers. And papers like the LA Times and the New York Times have the biggest readerships still in the country. A lot of that's based off of population, but both of those papers are also in national circulation. So these papers here, this was considered a pretty big circulation by that point, because if you remember, newspapers weren't sold like they were today. They were a little, comparatively, a lot more expensive, and they weren't meant for mass audiences yet. Mass meaning like everyday people. You would still have the mass because there were still lots of people reading it, but not nearly what we think of as mass today. Philadelphia had 7 newspapers by that point. And if you think about it, Philadelphia, their population at 25,000, Eugene and the surrounding areas, including Springfield, and so basically Lane County has something like 300,000 people. So Philadelphia was still really small at that time. Like I said, they were sold through subscription, and not necessarily where you just go buy it from like a street hawker or a child selling it on the street edge or whatever, or from a box like you see, you kind of see still. It was subscription based, almost like how the New York Times is now. You have to have a subscription to read it online. And that's kind of pretty much how it was back then. And generally, just like I mentioned in the last lecture, it was only people that could afford those subscriptions that would buy the paper outright. And then when they were done with them, they would share them at various gathering places, taverns and coffee houses, churches, and things like that. So that continued to be the way of sharing things at the time in the colonies. You would have somebody with the means to buy it, and then it would get shared. So if you remember the Gutenberg press, it was the first westernized printing press that built off of the Asian technology that had diffused to it at the time. And Gutenberg was the first one to print the Gutenberg Bible. And basically the technologies during the colonial days were pretty much the same. You had hand cranked paper presses that had paper fed into it, and type cloth meaning you would have type being set down, and then you would either have cloth paper or hemp paper or sometimes wood paper being used. And like I mentioned, U of O has an old book from the Roman days that's made of linen cloth, and it's really interesting to look at because linen cloth lasts a lot longer than paper does because there's no acid in how you make the material, and so it tends to just last over time. It doesn't degrade. And the ink at the time was made of soot, turpentine, and walnut. A lot of natural inks are still made very similarly, but generally inks in like your computer, excuse me, inks in your computer, inks that are made for printing processes of newspapers and stuff like that are made of synthetic inks made from petroleum. And back at this time, they were made of more natural sources because, again, petroleum was known, but it wasn't nearly as integrated with our life as it is now. So again, because we were colonies, we didn't have a whole lot of population yet, which means we didn't have a whole lot of infrastructure, and it was mostly resource extraction. That was the main economy at the time. So a lot of the materials that we used in the colonial days had to be imported from other places, mainly by England, because we were by that point an all English colony, even though we started with various other countries like New York was a Dutch colony, and Louisiana was a French colony, and stuff like that. And so a lot of stuff had to be imported at the time in order for us to use. And you see some of that still in places that are disconnected from the United States, like Alaska and Hawaii. They definitely import a lot of their goods still because they don't have either the necessary infrastructure to build those things or to make those things, or they don't have enough space. And you'll see that between state to state too. Like Oregon will import a lot of things like steel production or something that we just don't do here, whereas places like Ohio will import a lot of wood products. It's the same general idea, except for it was over most of the colonies by that point. We had resources, we just weren't doing anything with it yet, or much. So kind of like we mentioned in the last lecture, typical newspapers around that time were about 4 pages. There were 2 pages to a side, and it took a really, really long time to print them, between 1 and 2 days, just to set the type. And then, like we mentioned in the last lecture, most printers were also postmasters, because that's how information was gained. They had easy access to information, and it was just like a natural progression. But yeah, it took up to basically a full day to 2 days to just set the type so you could press the paper onto it. Pages 1 through 4 were generally done early, allowed to dry, and then pages 2 and 3 were done after that. So remember, this was hand done, so you couldn't do everything all at the same time, and it wasn't done mechanically like it is today. So because of that, it took quite a few days in order for the ink to dry, and then you had to press the rest of the news, and then you could send it out. So we're going to talk about the Stamp Act. So it was passed in 1765 by the British Parliament, and what it did was it imposed a tax on everything that was imported by the colonies. So remember, we had to import everything at that time, and we were heavily reliant on England and other imports. England to send us things like glass and certain processed papers and things like that. So things were heavily taxed as they came into the colonies. And the reason why these taxes came to be was as a way to pay for troops that were on the American frontier at the time. And if you remember, there were only 13 colonies, and the United States ended pretty much at Pennsylvania, the Appalachian Mountains. It hadn't even gone into the Ohio Valley or anywhere near Oregon yet, or anything like that. So it was still very much a frontier. By the west, it was unexplored. I mean, there were people there, obviously, and it had been explored by indigenous peoples, and occasionally some Westerners that had gone into it, to stay there. But it was considered wilderness at the time. And because of Native Americans and other countries that had a presence, such as France and Spain, troops had to be stationed on the frontier, and so England needed a way to pay for those troops, and the Stamp Act was one of the ideas that they had to do that. So they were taxing imports into the colonies. So you've often heard taxation without representation. This is where that comes from. So the Stamp Act was instituted by England without the feedback from the colonies, and it directly affected the colonies. And there were people within the colonies that believed that they should have input on the taxation of the colonies and how things were run. If the soldiers were being used for the protection of the colonies, then the colonists themselves thought that they should have input over how the colonies were taxed and other political happenings at the time. And the Stamp Act was one of those that was passed without any sort of input. So that's where you get the term taxation without representation. So the Virginia House, as a way to kind of show their displeasure for that, they passed the Stamp Act resolves. So again, remember that they're just colonies, so the Virginia House of Burgesses was still part of the English crown. It wasn't necessarily an American function by that point, but it was radical in the sense that it was English subjects passing resolves, or passing an opinion basically, that said that as colonists they did not like being taxed in that way, and that they should only be taxed by their own representatives. So the American colonies should be the ones to pass their own taxes and not the Crown of England. It was also called the Fatal Black Act, and it went into effect in 1765. In order to show that you were compliant with the act, that you were paying your taxes, you had to affix a stamp to each page of the newspaper. So if you look at, like a letter that you send through the USPS, if that's still a thing by the time we listen to this, you have to buy stamps and you have to place it on a letter, and that tells the Postal Service that you paid for the stamp and that you have the ability and you've paid to send that letter. This was the exact same thing but for newspapers. You had to adhere a stamp to these papers in order to show that you paid the tax. Now, at the time, it was roughly a penny for every copy of every issue. And remember, these only cost about 4 pennies-ish, right? So a 1 penny tax on each paper was about a 25 to 30% tax. And for a lot of people, that was stepping way too far. It was too much. There were also taxes on advertisements that were placed in there. So if you can imagine, like, cigarettes are heavily taxed now. I don't remember the tax rate. It's 15 to 20% depending on where you are. Imagine that with buying a DVD or something else. There are taxes associated with various media, but a 25 to 30% tax is really, really heavy. So obviously people were not happy. So when they had to do that, they complained that they would not be able to recover from the cost. So there are various examples of newspapers that would quote as a way of complaining that the paper would go under or that they were not happy with it. So a lot of papers would put certain mottos, like the Maryland Gazette put in certain hopes of a resurrection to life again, meaning that they were going to die. The New Hampshire Gazette put, "I must die." I mean, they were very blunt. And the Pennsylvania Journal actually said goodbye in French. So this is an example of the Pennsylvania Journal. In the upper right, you can see where the stamp was supposed to be affixed, but it's not actually there. That is part of their masthead for the newspaper at the time. That is them complaining that the stamp was going to kill them. So that's this right here. And you could see this. That's actually in their masthead, the skull and crossbones, meaning death. And then you have the "in hopes of resurrection to life again." And so imagine the New York Times doing something similar today. Like if Congress were to pass like a dollar tax, which is illegal, by the way, on newspapers, how they would look. Imagine the New York Times doing something similar to this. It was a big deal. The reason it's illegal is because you're not allowed to tax free speech in newspapers as part of the First Amendment. And not in this lecture, but in the next lecture, we'll talk about the amendments quite a bit more. So there were heavy protests. People didn't like it. The Crown doesn't look bad. Any sort of governmental figure, when they're being criticized heavily, they don't like looking bad. So it led to the repeal of the Stamp Act. And again, you have the no taxation without representation. But the English Parliament, they didn't learn much from it. So instead of taxing paper goods, or certain paper goods, newspapers and stuff like that, they decided to put more taxes on various other imports. So glass, lead, paint, certain paper products, not all paper products. All of those things, again, had to be imported from England or English colonies because we just didn't make them here yet. So like we do today, there were boycotts organized because people didn't agree with those practices. And there were a lot of objections going on, both in the press and in the streets. And John Dickinson published the letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania, which were basically a response to the acts from the perspective of a farmer, but kind of like we saw with some of the other examples in the last lecture, it was meant to be shown from one farmer, but it was actually letters from this particular person taking the appearance of a farmer, if that makes sense. So you're pretending to be a farmer. And it was one of the first times that you started to get this idea that any taxes imposed by the colonies should be dictated by the colonies, and that if they were levying taxes against colonists and the colonies, that was actually against the rules at the time, the English part of the English Constitution, or was considered the English Constitution at the time. So there were boycotts, and there were movements to, just like we saw with petroleum, around 2006 or 2007, when Bush II was in office. We started seeing more calls for the U.S. to produce more of its petroleum. And the reason why was that OPEC, which is like a conglomeration of oil producers that set prices. There were many people that felt that OPEC was, it's OPEC if you ever want to look it up, was basically taking advantage of the U.S. because we're a heavy oil consumer. So there were a lot of people at the time that were calling for us, to produce our own oil, which led to the increase in fracking and various other oil extraction processes. And you saw very similar things here, where there were calls for non-importation from England for the U.S. to start producing a lot of its own goods and services, and to boycott those goods and services and businesses that were cooperating. So what's interesting here is you see this a lot today with people choosing which businesses to frequent or where not to spend their money. And that's been going on since the beginning, or well before the formation of this country. People choosing where to spend their money based on the political clout of the businesses that they're looking at. So if they don't agree with it, they don't spend their money there. If they do agree with it, then they spend their money there. So it is one of those things that's been around in this country for a really, really long time. So there were riots that happened as a result of strict enforcement of the acts. Those were mostly in Boston. In one such riot, a boy was shot and killed by a customs officer. And there was a lot of call from certain people in the colonies for military assistance because they thought that certain colonists were getting out of hand. It's quite a lot different from what we've been seeing with the protests lately, but it's somewhat similar in that whenever there's protesting against the standards and norms of the time, there's usually always a call for some sort of military presence or police presence. So you can actually take a look at some of these Boston riots and be able to come up with similarities between then and most other quote unquote riots or protesting that were happening at the time, and how there's always some sort of presence in a lot of those that try to quell them. So that is a very current topic that you could explore more for your paper as well, if you wanted to. Eventually, England did send 4 regiments of British troops at the time. So imagine how ticked off Portland people were for the federal government to send police officers in that weren't marked, or they weren't able to be identified at first. It was very similar to this, where the British troops, even though you knew they were British troops, were sent into Boston to basically quell these riots. For your information, a regiment at the time, I believe, was about 800 soldiers. So that's 3,200 soldiers. That's quite a lot. They were partially repealed, but by that point, a lot of people were already pretty ticked off. So most of you have taken a U.S. history course, have heard of the Boston Massacre. It happened in 1770, right around the same time as those riots. And British soldiers killed 5 people and injured 6 others. One of the interesting facts about that incident, the incident on King Street, was that one of the people that was killed was an African American man, and you don't generally see that in visual representations of the event. But African Americans were there as part of the colonial effort in the US. They were protesting the same things, and they suffered the same consequences as white people did at the time. But they're generally not represented in the visual artwork, which we'll see an example of here in just a moment. So yeah, if you can imagine like the stuff that's been going on in the US recently, imagine how infuriated some people get when they see people being pushed down or treated unfairly. It was the same here. Once soldiers started killing people and injuring people, people were outraged by this idea of English soldiers killing people in the streets. And so what set off was this huge propaganda battle in the print that was available in the colonies at the time, continuing to show this divide between the Crown of England and the colonists, or some of the colonists. So you would have this divide at the time. And it was pretty interesting to read about, and some of the ways that it's aligning with some of the protests that are currently going on and have happened previously in this country. So the Boston Gazette, not Gazette, called it quelling the spirit of liberty, and they did not like the idea of having that massive amount of troops in the city. Also, there's a law, it's part of our rights that you can't have military troops stay in people's homes or take over people's homes in this country. And it was part of that you get that right here in this country. England was quartering troops in people's homes in the city as a way of watching them and as a way of giving them a place to stay. It's something that the US, through the Constitution, is not allowed to do anymore. Paul Revere engraved part of the event on a broadside. So remember, a broadside was like that Scooby-Doo thing that I had that's very large. And he printed, and remember, he was an engraver, so he engraved an image and then put it to print and then put it on a broadside. And it was circulated, but it wasn't completely accurate, but it was still enough to inflame people at the time. This is a representation of that. And the reason that it's inaccurate is, one, is the commander here has his sword raised, and it's shown that he tells his soldiers to fire on the people, where in reality it was like what happens in most riots, where somebody was freaked out, fired a shot, and then everybody else fired their shot. And you see examples of that in multiple riots and demonstrations across history. Another inaccuracy is that Butcher's Hall is where the import office was, and you can kind of see somebody firing a musket out of that office. So it's definitely a clear form of propaganda, right? It's trying to incite the people that are seeing this and reading the words that they should be really, really upset by this, which, I mean, in my opinion, they should have. A bunch of people died, but the accounting wasn't particularly accurate. It was meant to get people enraged. So it is an early form of propaganda-ish, and it's also an example of how media can be used to get people to form opinions and be able to do something. And in this case, fight for independence. So other than newspapers, you also saw pamphlets that disseminated information, and they tended to be a lot longer form than what you would see in newspapers. So newspapers, again, would be very limited in space. Pamphlets wouldn't be huge, but they would have more room for people to be able to print long form thoughts or letters or philosophical reasons why America should have their independence, things like that. So you definitely saw a lot of pamphlets at the time being produced. Some of the most famous ones are from Thomas Paine, called Common Sense and The American Crisis. If you're ever bored and you want to know or just read up on American independence or the thoughts and philosophy that were behind American independence, I highly recommend that you read this. It's not something that I signed for part of this class, but if it's a rainy day and you're curled up and you want something to read and Netflix isn't just doing it for you, pop that up. It's pretty interesting. This is just a visual example of some of how the pamphlets looked. They were bound usually with like hempen rope or something, and each page would have some sort of justification for why what was going on in the colonies was wrong. So here you see like horrid massacre. Just using the name massacre was inflaming dissent, right? So again, if you've taken a U.S. history class, you've heard of the Boston Tea Party, and that was also a result of the Townshend Acts. And they were eventually repealed in 1770, but as we all know, English colonies and English men and women loved their tea. And so at the time in the colonies, people still drank a lot of tea, and that was still the one of the only things that was continued to be taxed after the Townshend Acts were repealed. And people obviously continued to be highly incensed by that. And so we've all heard the story on how some colonialists, white colonialists dressed up as Native Americans, got on board a tea import ship, threw the tea in the harbor as a way of protesting the fact that the tea was being taxed. And like we saw with the imports of glass and other goods and services, people that were continuing to import tea with taxes were viewed as being enemies. So their product was being tossed into the sea or to the harbor. I'm going to give you a second to read through this, and I'm going to grab a drink. You might hear I have a pop. You might hear my pop. So remember that hard S that we were talking about in the last lecture was still going on at play here. Scandalous. This would be scandalous. Notoriously. If you need more time to read this, feel free to pause me and start me up again when you're done with it. But this is an example of things that were printed and then handed out at the time as a way to show their disgust for the sale of tea in the East India Company. So again, they threw tea into the harbor, and as you know, if you've ever thrown like a letter in a bottle into the ocean, it generally tends to float. And so even the morning after, they had people coming out into the harbor, taking the crates of tea that were still floating around and continuing to throw or try to get them to sink into the harbor. So that's something that's part of the Tea Party that's not generally reported on. It's just generally throwing tea into the harbor. But since it all floated, continuing in the morning, people continue to go out in the boats and try to get the tea to sink. If you think about it, that's actually a huge act of disobedience at the time, because there were warships, as noted here, in the harbor. There were military personnel in the harbor, and then there were still colonists that were going out and doing these types of things. So it's nothing new in America. That type of dissension is something that's not new. The Pennsylvania Packet said that letters from Boston complained much of the taste of their fish being altered by tea. And what that means is that since now the tea is resting at the bottom of the harbor, that all the fish that are swimming in the water now taste like the tea. And we can read this quote here from John Hancock. And he's not necessarily incorrect. The Boston Tea Party, it's quoted in American history that you hear in high school, generalized American history. as one of those events that united the colonies or helped unite the colonies. So the Battle of Lexington and Concord took place on April 19th, 1775. And, it's in the Boston area, if you've ever been there-ish, in that area. And most of the newspapers in town didn't actually print anything on it, because what do you do when a war breaks out where you live? You leave, right? Most of the time, you leave. So most, if not, I think all of the printers in town had left by the time that the battle had broken out, because they wanted to save their lives. So there was nobody in Boston or in the place reporting on the goings-on of the battles of Concord and Lexington up until a few days later. And the first one to report on the battles was actually a pro-Crown newspaper. And they were really, really careful in how they reported on it, because they didn't want to offend either side, basically in talking about how they reported the war. But the Boston Newsletter generally was a pro-Crown newspaper, and they were the first ones to report on it because they were still kind of in the area. So 5 days later, you saw the Boston Evening Post print a little bit on it also. So it took a while, right, to get news out at the time. And here again, you see this example of that S last week. 60 miles north of Boston, you had the New Hampshire Gazette, and it was one of the most earliest printings of the events on April 21st. So remember, that was April 19th that the battles took place. So it was just 2 days later, and it was 60 miles outside of Boston, that the first in-depth news on the battles were taking place. So it's interesting to think about in these days when we have 24-hour breaking news and reporters there all the time, that for people in the Boston area where this was taking place, the news took a while to get finished because nobody wanted to be around, and it was areas outside that were actually reporting on it. And it's also one of the few that were printed at the time that people still reference, which is also interesting to think about. It's a primary source. So this is an example of the New Hampshire Gazette. Notice that it used a headline on top of a dateline. And headlines weren't hugely common yet, but this is one of the first examples in the colonies that you saw the use of a headline. Some very, very quick retelling of words that is drawn to get, the intent is to draw people's attention, basically. Still used today, obviously, with everything that we read online. Everything has a headline. If you go on to Reddit, that's pretty much all people read, is the headline and not the articles. And so it's hard to imagine that there was a time when those weren't in practice yet. But this example of news from the Battle of Concord from the time is one of the first times it does that. So as I mentioned, there was a shortage of news coming out of those places. So not only was the New Hampshire paper reporting on that, you had other newspapers around the area also reporting. And when historians are looking at those papers to try to get a glimpse of what was going on at the time, it's really interesting to know that these people are not writing from the area. They're basically writing secondhand accounts. So in summary, printing, especially newspapers, it was one of the driving forces behind colonial America and the discontent in America at the time. There was a sowing of discontent based on taxation, the sowing of discontent based on how colonists were treated by the Crown, And it was interesting to note that there were people that were still loyal to the crown well through the fight for independence. Um, and the famous saying, the British are coming, the British are coming, it's an incorrect statement because everybody at the time was still British. So it's just something to think about. Newspapers and pamphlets and broadsides and quick printings were highly used at the time to spread propaganda, what is considered today propaganda, against the crown at the time, using the names or using terminology such as names and things like that to convey how evil the British were. So like the idea of serpents, betrayers, diabolical, tyrants, wickedness, all of them used that terminology. The Boston Massacre, right? And so you saw a heavy usage of that type of terminology. And the idea of liberty in those newspapers took off. That's why Americans are so ingrained in that idea of freedom and liberty in that sense, because we have our roots in those ideologies. And that was something relatively new. There's reasons why what we have as part of our culture these days were formed back in those days. So the First Amendment guarantees you the right to say what you want without government reprisal, right? Barring certain things, you can't set fire to a building. That's not considered free speech. But you can go up to the governor of Oregon and flip her off, and you can't be arrested. For example, I don't suggest you do that, because that is a form of free speech. You can make political cartoons of Donald Trump looking a certain way, and that is a form of free speech. And that all leads to these ideas of liberty and being able to criticize those who are in power, to question those who are in power, and as a form of liberty, be able to do those things. And so that's why we see the First Amendment and the freedom of religion generally in the Constitution. And that was generally a brand new thing that the world was experiencing at that time. Because remember, what we saw in lecture number 2 was that there were a lot of times when saying what you think about those in power was illegal. And it is still illegal in a lot of countries. And so the idea of freedom of speech in this country was revolutionary at the time. It still is revolutionary in a sense. You're not free from repercussion, but you are supposed to be from the government. But you're not free from repercussion from your fellow man, I guess. But the idea that you could do it and not go to jail for it was something that was really, really radical at the time. And there's a reason that it was put in the Constitution. So again, you saw loyalty change from the crown to the colonies. And if you are a J major, then, and even a PR major and advertising in a sense, then you can feel a kind of kinship, a continued kinship with those newspapers back in the day, that they were calling into question those people who were in power. And that's what newspapers and the news is supposed to be doing today. It's a check on power, right? And most historians point to that time in colonial newspapers and pamphlets as the time that got started in this country. So just kind of to end here, this is just an interesting thing to note, that there were accounts of the Declaration of Independence that were written about, but like all news at the time, it took a while for news to disseminate. And so the Declaration of Independence had already been signed, but certain news outlets were already still printing news well into days after it had been signed. So people around the colonies got information about the Declaration of Independence at varying times. It wasn't just at one time. And this is a very famous photograph, not a photograph, it's just a painting um, of all the delegates signing the Declaration of Independence. And what's interesting about this painting, along with the newspaper stuff that we just talked about, was that nobody that signed the Declaration of Independence, they weren't all in the same room at the same time. It took multiple days for everybody to get in there and sign it. So there was never an experience where everybody was in the same room at the same time like this. But that's just how it's been portrayed as a way of getting people to look at it and think about it. But yeah, looking at this kind of stuff is exactly what this class is about. It's not criticism in a way. It's not criticism. You have to think about that. History, again, like I mentioned in the introduction, is just a way, it's like science. You're presented with new facts, and then you take those new facts and then you put them in wherever they fit. So looking at a picture like this and saying the men that weren't there, it's not detracting from being more or less patriotic. It's just saying that you can still be patriotic that this happened. You can still be proud that eventually every man came in and signed the Declaration of Independence. But that the way that things are portrayed here in movies, which we'll kind of look at some examples here coming up in a couple days, they're not necessarily accurate. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but if accuracy is important to you, it's always good to know, right? And I think that's important as part of this class. So that's it for this lecture. And coming up in lecture number 4, we'll be talking about the popularization of the press, how it came to look like it did pretty much up until the year 2000. So thanks for hanging in there, and we will touch base again in lecture number 4. And as always, feel free to email me if you have any questions.